Good morning, everyone. As you get logged in, you'll see a survey on your screen. If you could take a second to fill that out, that'd be great. You can also drop into the chat we were calling in from today. While we wait, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Madison Burnett. I'm a BCBA. I lead our professional development program, and I'll be supporting throughout today's webinar. In addition to that role, I work alongside other BCBAs on our clinician-led recruitment team, and I support in the effort of recruiting quality professionals to join our team. If you are interested in joining MPG, please indicate so in the post-webinar survey at the end of this webinar, or you can email careers@manhattanpsychologygroup.com. I see we have quite a few returning guests, so thank you so much for coming back. And we do have some new ones as well, so we are thrilled to have everybody. Before we begin the webinar, on the next slide, you'll see a little bit about Manhattan Psychology Group. We were established in 2011, and we've continued to grow our team consisting of skilled adult and child psychologists, neuropsychologists, behavior analysts, special educators, licensed social workers, and behavior interventionists. Anita, if you could switch the slide, that'd be great. As a team, we're committed to wraparound care, which includes a wide range of services from mental health and testing to ABA and educational services. This holistic approach allows us to address various needs and challenges with compassion and care. We provide services to clients out of our Upper West Side and Long Island City offices in home, school, and clinic-based settings, as well as through telehealth. Our team is committed to serving individuals, couples, and families of all ages in diverse settings. We're also pleased to offer these free monthly webinars for parents and professionals where we will continue to learn and foster meaningful connections. Our vision at MPG is to create a future where individuals and their families feel supported, connected, and empowered, and our mission is to provide multidisciplinary integrated support for individuals and their families who experience mental health, behavioral, and educational challenges. And now I'm excited to announce MPG is hosting our first one-day virtual mental health and ABA conference on October 8th. This is focusing on the key benefits and strategies and collaborative approaches in wraparound care. This fully virtual conference will have a start time of 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time with a keynote address from Dr. Suzanne Go. We do have a number of different invited speakers joining us, including Drs. Shane Spiker, Mary Jane Weiss, Amanda Kelly, and many more. Registration is now open, so take advantage of our early bird prices before they go up. You can scan the QR code here, or I will also be dropping a link for the registration in the chat. All right, now on the next slide are some housekeeping informations for CEUs. For those seeking CEUs for this presentation, you'll need to stay on for the entire duration of this presentation. This presentation is scheduled for an hour, so that means a minimum of 50 minutes you need to stay on for a minimum of 50 minutes. We understand that there are some technical issues that could come up, so we will be collecting the cumulative amount to make sure that you are in attendance for the minimum. As of January 1st, we have started charging a nominal fee for continuing education certificates. This webinar is still free for you to attend, but will be $2.50 to obtain the CE certificate, and any polls during this webinar are not required, but they are encouraged. We'll be leaving the chat open, but please post any questions you have in the Q&A so we can make sure that they are seen. I'll end the poll now. And now I would love to introduce our speaker today. Anita D'Abbraccio is an award-winning educator with more than 20 years of experience supporting students with behavioral and emotional disabilities. She began her work in ABA in the 1980s and spent 2 decades teaching in a self-contained classroom. Anita later led a district-wide initiative applying ABA school-wide, resulting in a 50% reduction in negative behaviors. Now a BCBA, she is passionate about sharing practical, evidence-based strategies to support all learners and create positive school climates. And now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Anita.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and welcome everybody. As Madison was saying, I have had a long career, and 20 plus years of it was in a classroom for students with emotional behavioral disturbances, self-contained, pretty intense kiddos. But I want to back up just a little bit to give everybody just a little perspective about how I got here and why this reform experience was so profound and exciting for me, and why I'm passionate about sharing it with other folks who work in schools. In my early career, was the director of group homes for adults with autism, and who presented with quite a good set of severe behaviors. And so I was trained early on in ABA, but it was really not called that. Our training was it was less formal. It was on the job. It was often referred to as positive behavior management, but it was the basics of the science behind ABA. And I did that for quite a while. Then I had a family. I wasn't working. I was staying home. But my husband lost his job. I had a degree. I decided to go, start subbing. And so my first job, substitute teaching, happened to be in a classroom with students with severe emotional behavioral disturbances. And when I got there, I just thought, here's a place where this information that I had that I was using to make very small incremental changes in folks who had some pretty severe disabilities, um, especially cognitively. I found this new area with kiddos who were often quite bright, but had some really serious behavior and social delays. And I just found this rich area where ABA could be applied and we could make really big progress really quickly. And so that was very motivating to me. And I went home and I said, I'm not a stay-at-home mom anymore. I'm going to do this for the rest of my life because I really just found it so compelling. And so once I got into the school environment, of course, I wasn't a traditionally trained teacher, so I had had this behavior background and I had had a lot of experience hands-on. Um, and I was really convinced about the power behind using the science of behavior to help students individually, but I also, as I was in this environment, this new environment, I started looking around and I was going, a lot of what we're doing is sort of counter to what I know about behavior. And so I would talk with colleagues I worked in the same building as my sister. I would talk with my sister and I would say, the way you're responding to this behavior is kind of going to end up reinforcing it because I think you're meeting the function of the behavior with your response. And that was a whole new way for them to think about or look at behavior management. And so I did that, I sort of became the behavior guru unofficially in my buildings and in my district. And people would come to me. I did a lot of trainings and things. And I kept saying over and over, this could be applied more broadly. It doesn't have to remain an individual application. It can really be applied systems wide. And we could do some common things with this understanding of behavior and how it works. And so I was kind of yelling from the rooftops for years, but education it's a little entrenched sometimes, and it's hard to move out of the norms. And typically our response to discipline and behavior has been reactionary. And what I was talking about was something that was more preventative and positive. And so eventually I was working in a school that is an inner city school that had a lot of issues around behavior, around discipline, the gang related, guns in the school, fights every day, police presence every day. It was a K-8 school, but the littles were afraid to walk on the big kids' side, and the teachers were afraid to leave their classrooms and walk in the halls. So it was really quite an intense atmosphere. But in my room, those kids who were supposed to be the most severe students were actually functioning very well. They were making a lot of progress. There was, people noticed that when the really tough kids were sent to me, they managed to get on track and to progress. And then even once they left my classroom, maintained some positive trends. And so I actually had somebody from central office say, I've been watching the kids who leave your class do really well after they leave your class. So to me, that was a really good indication that we were generalizing well. But anyway, so we had a new principal who was tasked with reforming that very difficult school. And she asked me if I would consider stepping outside of the classroom and sharing with her, what I think we should do differently. So she asked me to go for a walk with her through our halls. And she said, just tell me what we're doing wrong. And so I walked with her, and our hallways were notoriously crazy. There was like people flooding, students in the hallway, sometimes playing soccer, sometimes fighting, sometimes loitering, sometimes just sleeping, some walking around. It was just a bit chaotic. And so I'm walking through the hallways with her, and all the adults in the hallways are talking to the students who aren't in class yet, patting them on the back, cajoling them, just having a lot of interaction with them. And so that was the mental note for me that these kids are getting a lot of attention when they're not in class. And so then we walked around and we were in the cafeteria of the building and there was lunch going on. There was actually a food fight. We walked in on the beginning of a food fight. And there was a lady with a microphone who was very exhausted and not interested in fixing the food fight situation. So I asked the principal to take the microphone. I stood behind her and I told her what to say. And I said, start by saying, anybody who's not in their seat, by the time I say one, will get a phone call home. I say it in a calm voice, but a firm voice. And she did that. And then I said, now count down slowly, but not too slowly, from 5 to 1. And she did that. And by the time she got to 1, and this was a few hundred kids, by the time she got to 1, the students were 95% were seated. And those few stragglers, we wrote down their names. And so we could do a phone call home. And after that, she just said, please, please, please come out of the classroom, show us what to do. I think we need a different approach. And so that's what we did. We spent we spent a lot of time training staff and changing our approach so that it reflected what ABA can teach us or what ABA tells us about behavior, the 3-term contingency, the function of behavior, and what maybe we've been doing wrong in education for a while. So to begin that process, I said, well, what I've really got to do is understand, because of course we don't want to be subjective about all of this. I needed to understand where the behaviors were happening, what circumstances they were happening in. Were there locations that were more problematic at certain times of day? And the beautiful thing about, the dashboards that we have access to now is that they do all that for you. I started out kind of trying to do it by myself, and then somebody showed me how wonderfully the dashboards work. And so I used that to do a very deep dive and really dissect the middle school behavior, the elementary behavior, the common behaviors. And we found some low-hanging fruit that we could start to address. And we also developed a list of students and teachers who needed additional support. So if a student had a lot of ODRs or office referrals or incidents, then we had a cutoff, so then we had a list of students who really had high needs, or high needs students. And it was a school of about 1,000. And then we had teachers who were writing a lot of ODRs. And so we looked at those teachers as people who needed some additional support and understanding around behavior. And I did that. I looked at the data and I kind of had an understanding of where the sort of easy targets were. And then I talked to a lot of staff, especially staff who were in the middle school side, and I asked what problems they saw. So I was getting sort of a on the ground view of how things were going, because that doesn't always come through in the data. And I wanted to kind of triangulate my sources. And I did a school walkthrough with the staff that had become part of the behavior team. So when we started the reform, they gave me resources, which was a beautiful thing. So I was the behavior coordinator. They gave me the hall monitors and some of what we called community connectors, and they were all part of my behavior team. And the behavior team was trained more extensively in ABA, and they were kind of the front line in the beginning of this reform. So I walked through with the hall monitors, who many of them had been in the school for many years. So they had some good historic awareness of problems that have existed and still existed in certain locations in the school and between certain groups of kids in the school, neighbors, gangs, things like that. And so we did the interviews and we did the walkthrough with the map, and I sort of marked where things were happening. They said the kids gamble here and they make out here and they do this here. And so I had a map of the school. I sort of marked where problematic areas were. And then I documented kind of all of that anecdotal information that was shared. Having done all that, I sort of synthesized that information into some focused priorities. So I looked at critical times and places. I identified the staff that could support in those places and those times. So I had my team, but we also asked the administrators. There were 4 principals and me as administrators. And so we asked them to be part of the reform interventions that were happening initially, the front loading piece of kind of shifting the way the school was functioning. We had other folks, librarian who wasn't on, anybody that was available, we pulled in to help us in those critical times and places. And I'll explain a little more about that later. We placed staff in those places and we trained them in a common response to behavior, to typical behaviors that we were seeing. So we didn't have one teacher or one hall monitor or one admin responding to out of classroom behavior in one way and then another one responding in another way. We were all responding to out of classroom behavior in the exact same way, and that really minimized the amount of attention students were getting, it kept that behavior from meeting its own function. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. We had a heavy, heavy, heavy focus on positives. That was something we trained in quite extensively. We had some initiatives around it. We did some probes and some data collection around it on the adults in the building and how positive, how often we were using behavior specific positive verbalizations. And that was something we really focused on throughout the reform. And we also focused on prevention. So if we saw something that was a potential issue, including fights between students in rival neighborhoods or whatever, if we heard it on the street, if we heard it from one of the students, if we heard it through a call to the school, we were really responsive with our attention to that potential issue. Using the bodies that we had and the team that we had built, we made sure that the students did some peer mediation, that we were strategic in making sure students weren't in the same location until things were resolved. We were really, really focusing on how can we prevent negative things and support positive interactions in the school building. We recognized there wasn't a lot we could do outside of the building, but in the school building, we owned that. We owned making sure those things didn't happen. So it was a big focus on prevention, and it was a big responsibility that we were taking on as a team. I gave the staff on my team and in the school very clear protocols for responding to those target behaviors. That common response was really prescribed because I thought that was very important to making sure that we were not accidentally reinforcing those behaviors like we had been in the past. So we ended up with sort of this 3-tier approach. I recognized that we couldn't determine the function of every single behavior that occurs, but that we could apply some general concepts to systems and strategies that minimize the potential of accidentally reinforcing undesired behaviors. So in our first tier that we were focusing on was the whole school system and maintaining a common response to typical behaviors based on positive supports and neutral redirection. So our interactions with our students went from argumentative, corrective, lecturing, relationship damaging quite often, to either positive or neutral. So that was a big shift. We had a lot of kind of consternation between staff and students prior to the reform, and we were really shifting it to positives. And if a student needed redirection, it needed to be neutral and not relationship damaging. That was an important concept that we built this reform on. The second piece was that we were also supporting in the classroom by developing a really structured classroom management system that was common among the classrooms and also based on positive supports and neutral redirections as well as consequences. The consequences were an important piece because we did want students to be taking responsibility, but we also wanted those consequences to be neutral, not relationship damaging, and to increase the students' capacity in whatever area they were sort of struggling in. So, and then tier 3 was making sure that those students who really had a higher need, that group of students that we pulled from that deep dive, that they had everything they needed to be successful in school. And we didn't always have to do an FBA to support those students. They were not always students with the label. In fact, often they were not, there were sometimes students that we could just look at their situation, give them one simple intervention and see big changes. There were also students who really needed the whole gamut. They needed the special ed services, the FBA, the BIP, but it was always designed to address student-specific needs. And those high needs students were a priority of ours right from the beginning. But today, and the next two, this is a series, a 3-part series. Today, I'm talking about the whole school approach. And in the subsequent sessions, I talk about the classroom management piece and then the individualized support. So one of the barriers that I had was that I was asking the adults in the building to take responsibility for providing support sufficient to prevent undesired behaviors. This is a huge shift. It was a huge shift in our building. I think it's a huge shift in any building to say we're not looking at the students to come in and the families to send the students in ready to behave perfectly, ready to learn perfectly. Because the reality was we had students and families who were struggling in many ways, and we were going to, if they were going to be successful, we were going to have to give support initially, a lot of support initially, but that support was designed to be faded. All of these strategies and all of the supports and even the personnel was designed to be faded so that as things progressed and as the reform took hold, we were pulling resources back and putting them in places of more academic places, and kind of allowing the new culture of the school to continue to evolve. And it did. And I'll share a little bit more about that. But it was a hard concept. It was a hard sell for a lot of teachers to say, you're getting some tough kids, and it's our job with you to figure out what these students need to be successful right now. I'm not going to ask them to do something they cannot yet do. I'm not going to tell them they have to sit for 45 minutes if we know they can't sit for 10 minutes. What do we need to do to make sure and what does a successful day look like for our high needs students especially? And what do we have to do to make sure they're successful? And that what do we have to do piece was again a hard sell. But I tried to let them know that front loading, that initial support pays off in the end. And rather than sort of having a school year that spirals out of control toward the end, we were in my classroom, and what I was predicting for this reform was that we would have a school year that got better as we got toward the end. We were, things would tighten up as far as structure and behavior being what you want it to be. But then when that piece tightens up, other things can loosen up, like the things that you can do in your classroom without fear of negative side effects. So I really tried to promote that notion of we're front loading, the payoff's coming. And it but this whole notion of supporting those initial behaviors, or making sure those initial negative behaviors don't happen by using positives and giving whatever support the student needs to be successful, gave us a chance to reinforce desired behaviors. Some of our high needs students, and even some of our students who wouldn't have qualified, are very they're students who were not hearing positive things from their teachers ever in their career. And so getting a chance to use behavior specific verbal praise with some of those students was really powerful, because it was sometimes a first for them to be hearing good things about themselves and to have the behavior that's appropriate for school identified so clearly for them. And especially with our littles, that was an important piece. So it was very counterintuitive. A lot of what I was asking staff to do was quite counterintuitive. And one of the procedures that I use, I think I go into a little more in this session. If not, it's in the middle session, the classroom management session. One of the strategy for students being in the hallway was to use our neutral redirection protocol. And that consists simply of giving a direction, giving some wait time for compliance, and then removing any verbals or interactions other than a gesture to where the student's supposed to be and a head turned away from the student, and really nothing else. And so the hall monitors, who now I've changed everything about the way these hall monitors were working. They were sort of just waiting for things to happen and then they would respond. Here I'm asking them to post in different places. I had very clearly eyes on every single aspect of the school, where I posted different people on the behavior team, and they were responsible for maintaining the order in that section of the building. And I'm just really changing things from the way they had worked for many years to this new set of responsibilities. And so this notion that they were going to stop talking to the kids and they were just going to point, they were going to turn, they just thought I was crazy. And fortunately, I had a friend in the hallway, a friend who kind of understood what I was doing. I got a lot of pushback from a lot of staff through this, through the initial stages of this. They really did think I was a little nutty. And so the hall monitors were talking, and my friend was close by and heard them saying, yeah, I think Anita's not all there. She's really, this is a lot that she's, telling us that this is going to work. And so they sort of jokingly, they said, let's try it. Let's just, let's try it. We can tell her we tried it, and we'll tell her it didn't work. And so they tried it with a notoriously, off-task student who was in the hallway a lot. One of the hall monitors tried it. She did it exactly as I had trained her. She pointed, she gave the direction, she pointed, she turned her head away from the student. The student acted up a little bit, tried to get some attention. All the other hall monitors refrained from giving attention. In the past, they would have all said something. Nobody said anything. Miss Ann kept pointing and turning her head, and eventually the student went in the classroom. And my friend who witnessed all this had to text me right away and say, I wish you had been there for that, because they were stunned that it worked. I was actually stunned that it worked the first time it was tried, because I would have expected a few more trials before it was that effective. But they started to see that what I was asking them to do might potentially change the way our school was running. And they slowly but surely got on board. It took a little while, but they did eventually get on board. So we were looking at changing our school system, all the way around how we function in our school, our behavior supports, and our discipline. But it was also based on compassion and understanding, which is something that our population really needed. We were working with students who had suffered abuse, neglect, trauma, sometimes all three. And we didn't, it was important to the administrator, especially the principal who asked me to lead this reform, that we changed the tone of our school and how the adults were interacting with the students, because we understood that our students were coming to us with higher needs than maybe another school. And so it was important to us that it was compassionate and it was understanding. Anytime we were looking at a high needs student, the first thing we looked at was basic needs. What are there any basic needs that aren't being met? Is there any illness or pain or medical issue that we can help with? And at first you think that's quite unlikely, but we ended up with students who needed glasses, and glasses fixed a lot. Or we had one little boy who had terrible eczema and was in pain all the time. And so, parents really didn't have the resources, the understanding of how to get that addressed. But once addressed, that student did much better. So there was a lot around what are the basic needs before we went into anything deeper. It was trauma safe in that we're not being critical, we're not being harsh, we're not being anything but positive or neutral. So that was really helpful for our students who were coming to us pretty raw from some recent trauma, and we did have quite a few students like that. It was integrated with the concepts of positive behavior interventions and supports. So the PBIS piece of our building was just sort of blended into what we were doing as the behavior reform and the behavior team. And we worked very hard to make sure that the school culture and climate was functioning as a non-contingent reinforcer. We wanted it to be fun to be in our school, to feel safe, to feel fun, to feel included was an important aspect of this reform. And we did things like everybody got the name of 3 or 4 kids, and we made sure to reach out to those students throughout the school year, just to make sure that there was no student in our building who didn't have some positive contact with somebody other than their teacher, and to kind of shift that climate that we had been struggling against. And it was very important that we were relationship building while also demanding a lot of our students. It was really important to us that we were not just making everybody happy in the moment, because that doesn't last very long. We really wanted to be increasing student capacity, increasing their responsibility and for their own behavior and their accountability. And so I had one student, big kid, he would have thought he was playing college ball, big football player. he was gang affiliated, tough kid. He really was, he really was struggling when we first started this reform. And he would sometimes get sent to me, but I would hold fast with him, and I would do the neutral redirection, and I would do the positives when I could catch him doing the right thing. And I would hold the line every single time he was pushing it. And he hated me. And he would tell me every day, I hate you. I hate you. I cannot stand you. And, every day I was there to say good morning to him and to be there to hold him accountable, to make sure he was in class, to call his mom if if that's what he needed. And by the end of the year, after telling me he hated me in more colorful language almost every day, toward the end of the year, he came into my office and he said, "Can I talk to you?" Which shocked me a little bit. And I said, "Of course. And, what can I do for you?" And he said, he had started to do really well. He went from being very problematic in the school to suddenly I hadn't heard from him very much other than just saying good morning. And then all of a sudden he was in my office and he said, "I really want, there's a private school in town," and he wanted to go there and he needed um, a letter of recommendation from several teachers. And he came and he sat down and he said, "You were really a B." He said, "You were really tough on me." And I said, "Yes, I was." And he said, "And I was really tough on you." And I said, "Yes, you were." And he said, "But I get it now, Mrs. D. I think I get it." And I was like, "Well, I'm glad to hear that." He was an eighth grader, so I wasn't going to see him anymore. And he asked me if I would write him a letter of recommendation for this private school he wanted to go to. And that moment was really important to me because this was a kiddo who was struggling with the changes we were making because his off task and a defiant behavior had been working for him quite well. He was getting what he wanted. Um, but it wasn't what he needed. And that's what I shifted and changed for him. And the fact that he was able to recognize that was pretty impactful as far as I was concerned. So again, we were really focused on being compassionate, understanding, and building our relationships with our students. There are typical functions of behavior in the school, right? I mean, we know there are some limited functions of behavior in general, but the function of your average behaviors that you're going to see every day in the school setting can be broken down to a few. Task avoidance and escape, situation avoidance and escape, and detention. Now, there is a sensory piece that sometimes plays a part, but I kind of pull that out because sensory needs to me are a little bit different. And I might handle that in another session sometime because they're definitely a different, I think they need to be handled slightly differently. So students being in the hallway, task or avoidance, task or situation avoidance, task or situation escape could apply to both those. But once they've escaped the task or the situation, they're in the hallway and they're receiving attention very often, positive attention, playful attention. If not positive and playful, maybe they're getting scolded and yelled at and argued with, but at least it's attention. And so it's working for them. It's also keeping them away from the task and the situation that they were trying to avoid. So we knew this. We knew, okay, these are the most likely things that are maintaining this behavior. And especially for our high needs students, we were looking at those behaviors and what was likely maintaining them. And we were changing our response, our common response to behavior, so that we were not accidentally meeting the function of the behavior with our response to it or a redirection of it. So a lot of times in schools, our responses to behavior do that. They provide exactly the function of the behavior. We have little kids who are disruptive in class and they get sent to the office. And while they're in the office, they're getting maybe a piece of candy, maybe they play checkers with the principal, they're just out of the room for a while. Other things can happen too. I'm just using one example that does happen sometimes. Even if they don't get a piece of candy and play checkers, they might be sitting in the office, and a lot of stuff happens in a school office that's very entertaining. And they're missing the work that they were disruptive during. And very often that work doesn't follow them. They miss it and nothing happens, as a result of that. So we're really looking at what are we doing as a response to this behavior, and is it reinforcing the behavior? And so very often we were seeing that yes, what we did in response to behavior was in fact reinforcing it. Um, the whole notion of breaks, it is a fine notion. I think students need breaks, especially our sensory kiddos need breaks. But when we give a student a break immediately after a non-preferred behavior, which happens quite often, we reinforce that non-preferred behavior with the function of the behavior, which is escape or avoidance. And that gets really hard to explain to staff who find relief in the break themselves. So the students misbehaved. I don't want any further misbehavior. Let's take a break. Both the staff and the student end up being reinforced by that. But we're reinforcing that negative behavior. And that's something that we had to change. We had to change when we're applying those interventions and making sure it wasn't after an undesired behavior, but rather after a desired behavior. We give choices a lot, and that's, again, very often is the function of the behavior is I don't want to do this thing. So when you give some choices, then I've learned that I don't have to do this thing. I can do these other things instead. And as far as attention goes, we give so much attention to negative behaviors, to behaviors we don't want to see. We spend a lot of time in schools addressing them. And what I was saying, which felt very counterintuitive to everybody, was stop talking, stop saying students' names when they're misbehaving, reduce your conversation with them. They don't need lectures. They already know what's expected of them in the school setting by the time they're in 6th grade or even 3rd grade. We don't need criticism. We don't need cajoling or bribing or negotiating. One of the things that was really difficult for my staff to comprehend was that I said, I don't want those restorative conversations to happen while a student, right after a student exhibits a negative or an undesired behavior. Those restorative conversations need to happen after we've had some period of calm and on-task behavior. Then I love them. Then I think they're very important, but not in the, I don't like debriefing immediately after an incident. So that was one thing we changed too. And another thing we changed that they really didn't understand was cleaning up messes. So if somebody tore up the hallway, then they felt like it was the right thing to do to make that child get out there, make that child pick up the mess, make that child tape things up, put things back. And listen, kids love to be in the hallway. They love to use tape. They love to use the broom and the dustpan. They love to be stapling things back up and maybe working one-on-one with an adult who's helping them do that and getting lots of attention for it and attention from people who are passing by. I changed the way we did that. If somebody was destructive in the hallway, they would have whatever consequence that was appropriate for that. And I would ask another student to come and help somebody else or me put the mess back together, essentially. And so that student who hadn't misbehaved got to do something that was out of the norm and fun and had some extra attention to it. And the student who had done the destruction wasn't getting that extra time and attention for the misbehavior. So I know a lot of people have a hard time with that, but I promise you it changed so quickly how often our halls were torn up. It was it had a big impact on that kind of destructive, explosive behavior. So those commonly used interventions that teachers learn about every year, that are really promoted and encouraged, can be interventions that lead to an increase in student behavior and a decrease in student capacity. So flexible seating, we have a kiddo who's very, who moves around a lot, who's very animated in class. And rather than teaching a little bit of self-control, especially as that becomes more age appropriate, we're giving a tool. And I'm not against flexible seating. I'm not against, flexible seating isn't really the right term for this, but I'm talking about the wobble benches or, seats or whatever. I don't have a problem with those. I think they can be really effective. The problem is if we give it to a student and it increases their off-task, very active movements, disruptive movements, then it's not the strategy to use. And a lot of times it's increasing that negative behavior and decreasing the student's capacity to sit still. And I would much rather build on the success of a period of time of calm seat, calmly sitting in their seat. And we talked about breaks, and there was another thing that went through schools, and I think some people still use it, with tab boxes were a big thing. And there were, it was manipulatives, things that kids could play with in a box, and they could have it if they were starting to get dysregulated, off task or whatever. But it was very often being paired with these negative behaviors. So we would see a big increase in negative behaviors so that kids could have access to those tab boxes. So there's just a lot of potential downside if staff aren't trained to make sure that those interventions, which again, I don't have anything against any of these interventions, it's just how and when we apply them that can be really problematic. And if staff can be trained and understand what we're pairing, the behavior we're pairing that intervention with should be a positive behavior prior to the student getting it, is, so that was the shift that we made. I think it's important that staff get training and how to use those things, because it becomes very demoralizing when you tell staff, here's the strategy, use it, and things get worse in their classroom. It's very demoralizing and frustrating for them. It's much better to say, here's the strategy and here is how you need to use it to make sure it increases student capacity and decreases that negative behavior. So we implemented a whole school common response to those general behavior challenges that included positives. That was our focus first, was on the positives. It utilized a common cue, which was a 5 count. Everybody across the building, all adults, were using a 5 count to give students some time to process and time to be on task and do the things that they need to do. And we used neutral direction as a common protocol for off-task behavior or work refusal. And we use neutral consequences. Again, the positives as an antecedent intervention, but the neutral as a consequent intervention. So if a student received a consequence, it was given in that neutral, non-relationship damaging manner. The 5 count looked like this. I like to go through this because it's just so practical, but it seems like it's something that once teachers start using it, they realize that there's some really good qualities to using this system, rather than a teacher says something and the students call back, or a bell, or something that's sort of a one and done cue. This is just proven to be much more effective in my 20+ years plus this reform. So we give one direction. I'm sorry, we give the direction. We wait. This says 1 minute. It's 1 minute is actually maybe too long. 20 seconds, 30 seconds. We give a warning, a reminder in a calm, neutral tone, and only once. We're really minimizing how much we're verbalizing when students are off task. We begin counting down from 5 to 1. This is really, really practical stuff that I'm sharing right now. And it's an important protocol that really changes the way a classroom and a school function. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and we're not mad, we're not yelling, we're not angry, we're not doing anything but counting down. As you get good at it, you're teaching while you're counting down. If you have a group shifting, or if you could, or if you have one student off task and you're doing a 5 count just for the one student, you can keep teaching, keep the students focus on you. But when you reach 1, and this will be explained further in the classroom management piece, but when you reach 1, and I always had a clicky pen so the student could hear the click, and you just give 1 check mark in a very neutral manner. Again, calm tone, no facial expression, no talking at all. You just, next to their name on a clipboard, give a check mark. And that check mark equates to a consequence in that classroom management protocol that we go over in the second session. So that's the 5 count. It's super simple, but the beauty of it is it gives students who have some processing delays time to catch up with their counterparts who don't. So, the student who hears it the first time and is ready to go by 4 is good to go, but also that student who doesn't hear it the first time starts to see all those other students starting to move toward their desks, and then they can kind of look around and figure out something's changing. They can process. That's why I like to give maybe another warning or read another direction if I see a student maybe didn't process the first one. So it gives the teacher the ability to calibrate a little bit. Beginning of the year, maybe you're counting slower. End of the year, maybe you're not even doing a 5 count anymore. I always started with 5, but I would just say 5 by the end of the year. I would just say 5 and everybody would go where they needed to go. I might not even ever get to 4. But you can calibrate for the class, for the time of year. You can calibrate for the student who's a little slower in processing. And then the neutral redirection protocol was another key piece to what we were doing. And that was, again, this is a very structured protocol. The teacher gives the student a verbal instruction. The student doesn't comply within 20 seconds. Teacher turns the head away. We avoid eye contact. We use only gestural. So if it's elbow to elbow seat work, we point to the paper, or we, like in the story about the hall monitor, we point in the direction the student's supposed to be. When the student starts to exhibit any behavior toward engaging in the direction that they were given, then the teacher starts to give a little too. So the student who's refusing work picks up their pencil, you might turn your body or turn your head back. And then the more they start to work, you're turning your body more toward them. You may be giving them a gestural thumb up, a pat on the back, whatever. You can start giving those positives as they start engaging in the behavior you want to see. If they stop again, they refuse again, you turn away again. And it works quite quickly and quite well to do that. If at the end of the allotted time, this is again going to be reviewed more in the classroom management piece, they haven't finished the activity they're doing, that work is actually saved for them and they're expected to do it later, but they're not scolded about it. It's just in your folder. It's in your unfinished work folder. We're not going to get in a power struggle during the activity. We're not going to get in a power struggle later either, and we're not going to lecture, but here it is. Before you can do something preferred, here's something you need to finish. So it's a very natural consequence to that refusal behavior. So the results of all of this were quite impactful. We did reduce our incidence by over 50%. With this 2019, 2020 was 3/4 of a year. So this actually would have been higher than the 2018, 2019 number of incidents would have been way up here. We began the reform in 2020, 2021, which was an interesting year to begin it. We did get extra time to do trainings and stuff, so that was good. But we only had a quarter of our student body was in person. So this number has a big old asterisk by it, obviously. But this number is pretty telling. We would have been up here over the 3,000, over the 4,000 mark, if based on the trajectory that the data was giving us, if that year hadn't been truncated. But we came down to almost 2,500 the following year, and then the next year, not even 1,000. And that trend has continued. The trend of decreased incidents and decreased suspensions as well. And then I'll show you this next slide, which was actually my favorite result that we got. This is incidence by ethnicity. And we really closed our gap between our African-American students and our other students in our population. We really closed that gap in the years that we did this, in the 3 years that we did this. It's continuing, the reform is continuing. It's hard to call it a reform when it's 5 years in, but I always looked at it as a 3-year project. And in those 3 years, this was the result we got as far as closing that gap, that ethnicity gap. And that was a big win as far as I was concerned. So we can stop there. Madison, are you there?
I'm here. Yes. So we do have several questions in the Q&A. Are you able
Okay.
to pull it up, or do you want me to read them to you?
Can you read them to me?
Yes. So Stacy is asking, were there any other strategies used to gain buy-in from school staff members and faculty for improving your reform procedures?
You know what? I honestly, without being dramatic, I was really hated. People did not like any of what I was sharing with them. And my only strategy was to be as Teflon as I could be, is to recognize, to do what I taught them to do, was to not take behavior personally. I couldn't take their frustration, their anger, I couldn't take any aspect of it personally. I was shaking their world up. And so the only strategy I can say is you've got to be tough and you've got to ride it out. But I used a lot of positive reinforcement with my staff and with the school staff. Every time I saw them doing something that was a part of the reform and doing it well, I made sure I was really highlighting that for them personally, but then I would also highlight it in our shout outs that we had and just staff meetings and things like that, because it was really important, I think, A, to model what I was asking them to do with the students, but also they needed that encouragement, and I needed to make sure I was highlighting when they were doing the right thing.
All right. Ian is asking, how did behavior consulting and support look like following all three tiers for PBIS and MTSS among specialized staff, such as school counselors, school psychologists, etc., at individual schools and district-wide?
All right, I think I need to break down that question a little more. Can you read it again?
How did behavior consulting and support look like following all three tiers for PBIS and MTSS among specialized staff at both individual schools and district-wide?
So we did not do this district-wide. We only did it in one school. The school psychs and those other folks that you've listed they were part of the team. They I'm trying to think how to answer this. I'm not sure I totally understand the question. Um, they supported the way they typically supported as far as sort of student plans and things like that, but they were sharing in with us a new focus on developing behavior plans, behavior interventions that were individualized, that were in keeping with all of the other reform. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Ian, if not, feel free to clarify in the Q&A.
Yes, please.
All right. Eileen is asking, how do you deal with a parent who tends to reinforce their child's problem behavior and do not buy into positive intervention strategies at school?
So, I mean, there's two things. One is I try to reach out as much as I possibly can and bridge the divide between home and school as far as behavior supports go. But I also recognize that the only thing I can control is the walls that we have the student within, right? And the time that we have them within. I, again, use a lot of positive reinforcement with parents, and I'm very honest with them. I've always been super honest with my parents as a teacher and also as an administrator. If I think that they are not supporting what we're doing at school by some response that they're having at home, I will tell them that, but I do it in a very professional way. And I say, one of my favorite lines that I've said 1,000 times is, I know that if you and I work together, we can help get him back on track or get her back on track. And that's such a simple sentence, but it's really impactful when I'm talking to a parent who maybe disagrees with me or who maybe uses some strategies that are not best practice. If I say that to them, then I can also say, but here's what I'm doing, and I need you to complement that at home. I need you to help out with that at home. So I hope that answers your question, but I try really hard to reinforce anything I see that is in keeping with what we're doing at school. I try to be honest with the parent, and I try to encourage a partnership. And I do that with really positive language about the results.
Right. So the next question is, what are some consequences you use for the destructive students if they weren't required to clean up?
So that would be definitely covered much more clearly in the second session, but our classroom management piece has a time-based incentive built in at the end of each day, and then a longer and more preferred one at the end of each week. And there's a hierarchy of consequences that I can't go into right now because it would take too long. But a student who was destructive would lose some of that incentive time as a result of their destructive behavior.
All right. And then Ian did follow up. He said, did consultation and support look like various modalities, such as meetings, presentations, etc., to the specialized staff members in addition to teachers and administrators?
Is he asking if there were other people supporting providers in this new set of strategies?
Either that, or did you have a separate training for those members? Did the training itself look different?
No, everybody in all the school staff were trained similarly. They were in the same trainings.
Okay.
Um, some staff had more training, like the people on the behavior team had more training in ABA, and some staff had less. Some of the staff had more training in the practical application of the protocols rather than kind of the theory behind the protocols. Um, but those other support staff they were getting more of that ABA piece than the protocol piece.
The next question is, I'm also curious about encouraging buy-in from staff. A big challenge I face as a contractor slash consultant is getting admin to provide some accountability to staff. Did you ever use ABA interventions to reinforce staff engagement and buy-in?
I tried to build into all of my behavior intervention plans, sort of the BST model, where I wrote my plans in a way that you literally could check off. You could use them as an observation sheet and check off whether each component of the plan was implemented appropriately with during an observation of the teacher implementing the plan, and then go through the whole BST process with them. I did not get very far in training administrators on how to do that. That was a piece that I didn't get to, but we were working on it, and they have continued. Now, I'm not in that school anymore. I'm an independent consultant now, and but I'm connected to the staff there. We have a really good relationship, and so I'm sort of pro bono working with them and helping them to establish some of that structure within their plans. And even within the protocol that was already in place, making sure they're being followed, because you have to kind of maintain that high level of adherence to it.
All right. And then the next one, what about students who walk around together in a group and whose function of behavior is maintained by student attention? They don't care if staff ignore.
That is a very good question. Um, we so it would be maybe on an individual basis that we would look at that, but um, there was a piece early on in today's presentation where I talked about prevention. And so if we did have like three girls who would walk all the time together. And so, but they wouldn't start that until, of course, they met up in the morning, maybe at breakfast or whatever, and then off they'd go. And so we actually very strategically used our bodies and our walkies to say, Brooklyn's coming through this door at this time, and so is coming through this door at this time. And we're heading this one this way, and we're heading that one that way. We kind of kept them separate until they got to where they needed to go in the mornings. And then we heavily reinforced them being where they were supposed to be. And we gave them some time together at a later date or a later time in the day. Said, hey, you guys made it to class. We are really proud of you for that. Finish your lunch quickly. You can come hang out here, in this person's classroom and just talk and, give, but they're not losing any instruction time, of course. So that was that prevention piece when we knew there was a problem and it wasn't easy for the protocol to address, then we used some, creative strategies like that.
Fantastic. All right, I think that is all the time that we have for Q&A right now. If you did have any additional questions, feel free to drop it in the chat, and I'll be sending everything on to Anita for her expert opinion on her responses. In the chat, I just dropped a link for part 2 and part 3. Anita, if you can click onto the next slide. You will also see QR codes to access those presentations. They will be available on our website following the conclusion of this presentation. If you have any questions, I've also dropped into the chat our email that you can reach us at. Again, if you have any questions for myself, for Anita, please email professionaldevelopment@manhattanpsychologygroup.com, and I'd be happy to either answer your question or post you through to Anita. And then if you have, I will also stay on for a few extra minutes for any additional questions that do come in, just so I can make sure I collect them all. But Anita, thank you so much for this presentation and for your series. I know there's a lot of interest, and I think it's great timing being that schools are just about to get started. And then for Abigail who just asked if CEUs are available, there is one general learning CEU available for each of these parts of the presentation. So today's presentation is available for CEUs. We'll be reviewing attendance records following the conclusion of this event, just to make sure that everybody's meeting the minimum requirement, and an email will be sent out following. I would expect that within the next hour or two. But Anita, thank you so much. And thank you
Thank you,
everyone for joining
everybody.
us
Thank you,
today.
Madison. Have a
Yeah, of
great
course.
day. Have a good school year, everyone.
Yes, thank you.